Nobody expected a football match to take place in the middle of a war zone. Not between two armies trying to kill each other. Not in freezing mud, surrounded by corpses, barbed wire, and the wreckage of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And yet, on Christmas Day in 1914, in the middle of the First World War, something happened that still sounds almost impossible more than a century later. British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, shook hands in no man's land, and according to countless accounts, they played football together. A game in a place where no game was ever supposed to happen. Welcome back to GameBlueprint. Today, we're diving into one of the most unbelievable stories in football history. This is not a Champions League final, not a World Cup classic, and not a match remembered for trophies or tactics. This is the story of a football match played during war, in one of the darkest moments Europe had ever seen. A match that has become part history, part myth, and part symbol of what football can mean when the world around it is falling apart. Because this wasn't just about a ball being kicked across a field. It was about humanity, survival, and a brief moment when football did something almost unthinkable. It stopped a war, even if only for a day. To understand why this story matters so much, you have to go back to 1914. Europe was collapsing into chaos. In the summer of that year, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, alliances triggered one of the biggest wars the world had ever seen. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and others were pulled into a conflict that nobody truly understood at the beginning, but millions would eventually die in. Soldiers were told the war might be over by Christmas. That turned out to be one of the cruelest lies of the entire conflict. By December 1914, the Western Front had become a nightmare. The war had stalled into trench warfare. Instead of fast victories, both sides were trapped in long lines of muddy trenches stretching across Belgium and France. These trenches were miserable beyond imagination. Men lived surrounded by rats, disease, freezing water, and the constant threat of artillery fire. They watched friends die beside them. They slept in mud. They lived with the smell of death. And in between all of that, they waited for the next order to attack, knowing it could mean running into machine gun fire with almost no chance of survival. The space between the two sides was known as no man's land, and that name tells you everything. It was a deadly strip of open ground covered in craters, corpses, wire, and shattered earth. If you stood up in daylight, you could be shot instantly. If you tried to cross it, you might never come back. This was not a football pitch. It was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. But that was only the beginning. As Christmas approached in December 1914, something unusual started happening. Along parts of the front, especially where British and German troops were stationed close together, the fighting began to slow. Not officially. No government had agreed to peace. No generals had ordered a ceasefire. But the soldiers themselves were exhausted. Many of them had been listening to each other for weeks from opposite trenches, only a short distance apart. They could hear voices, songs, and even jokes shouted across the lines. In some areas, the men had already developed a strange kind of relationship with the enemy. They were still enemies, still armed, still capable of killing each other. But they were also human beings sharing the same misery. Then came Christmas Eve. As darkness fell on December 24th, British soldiers began hearing something from the German trenches. Singing Christmas carols. One of the most repeated stories is that German troops placed candles and lanterns on small Christmas trees along the edge of their trenches. Imagine that scene for a second. In a war zone filled with gunfire and fear, there were suddenly lights glowing in the darkness and soldiers singing Silent Night. British troops responded with songs of their own. At first, it must have felt surreal. Then came the shouting across no man's land. Christmas greetings, jokes, calls to come out. At first, nobody trusted it. Of course they didn't. This was war. A trick could mean death. But in some sectors, the voices kept coming. German soldiers reportedly shouted that they would not fire if the British didn't fire. Slowly, cautiously, men began climbing out of the trenches. Unarmed in some cases. Hands raised in others. And what happened next changed everything. The two sides met in no man's land. Think about how insane that moment must have felt. Men who had been ordered to kill each other were suddenly shaking hands. They exchanged cigarettes, food, buttons, alcohol, and stories. Some helped bury the dead who had been lying in no man's land for weeks. Others posed for photographs together. They talked about home, about families, about how old they were, and what they had done before the war. For a brief moment, the uniforms disappeared and the humanity returned. Nobody saw this coming. Not the officers, not the governments, not the men themselves. And somewhere in the middle of this extraordinary truce, football entered the story. Now, this is where history becomes both beautiful and complicated. There was no official match report, no referee, no stadium cameras, no confirmed team sheets. This wasn't a properly organized game with 90 minutes and clear rules. But multiple accounts from soldiers on both sides suggest that football was played during the Christmas Truce. In some places it may have been just a kickabout. In others, witnesses described something that sounded much more like an actual match. The details vary, and historians still debate exactly how many games took place and where. But what matters is this. Enough evidence exists to make one thing clear. Football was part of the truce, and in at least one section of the front, a real match appears to have happened. One of the most famous accounts came from Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, a German soldier, who later described seeing British soldiers with a football and a spontaneous match taking place. Other letters from British soldiers mention football being played on the frozen ground. A soldier from the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment wrote about a match that the Germans supposedly won 3-2. That score has become legendary over time, repeated in books, documentaries, and newspaper stories. Whether every detail of it is perfectly accurate is still debated, but the image has survived for a reason. German and British troops, in the middle of a world war, playing football in no man's land on Christmas Day. It sounds like fiction, but it happened closely enough to truth that it has become one of the defining images in football history. And maybe that's what makes this story even more powerful. Football wasn't brought there by officials or planned as a peace event. It emerged naturally. It was instinctive. When the weapons went silent and the men were allowed, even briefly, to be human again, one of the first things they reached for was a football. Not because it was important in a military sense, not because it changed the war strategically, but because football was familiar. It was home. It was normal life. For British soldiers especially, football had already become deeply woven into working-class culture by 1914. It was the game of factory towns, schoolyards, and weekend crowds. For German troops too, football was growing fast. In that moment, the game became a shared language. The image of that match matters because of where it happened. This wasn't played in peace. It was played in the middle of industrial slaughter. Men who had watched shells tear bodies apart the week before were now dribbling a ball through mud. There were no proper kits, no chalked lines, no tactical whiteboards. Some probably played in heavy military boots. The pitch was a scarred battlefield. The crowd was made up of armed soldiers who would soon go back to fighting. And yet for one brief moment, football was stronger than fear. However, the story didn't end there. In fact, the most tragic part came immediately after. The Christmas Truce did not spread across the entire front, and even where it happened, it didn't last long. High command on both sides was furious when they learned about it. The idea of soldiers befriending the enemy was deeply threatening to military discipline. Generals needed men to keep fighting, and it becomes much harder to kill someone once you've shaken his hand, shared his food, and played football with him. Orders soon came down to prevent anything like this from happening again. Troops were rotated. Artillery resumed. Snipers returned to position. The war restarted. That is what makes the story so haunting. The same men who exchanged gifts and kicked a football on Christmas Day were, in many cases, back to shooting at each other within days. Some of them likely died shortly after. Some would never make it home. The war itself would continue for nearly 4 more years and claim millions of lives. The peace football briefly represented was crushed by the machinery of war. Things were about to get even worse. The First World War would become more brutal, not less. Poison gas, endless offensives, and horrific casualty numbers would define the years that followed. Battles like the Somme and Verdun turned entire landscapes into graveyards. By the end of the war in 1918, an estimated 16 million people were dead, and many more were wounded or psychologically destroyed. Against that